Thank you for joining us again for another CARISTEM event. This time we discuss, will COVID-19 stimulate an environmental awakening in the Caribbean? We have Joe joining us. Joe is a sustainability officer. Her background is environmental sustainability. I'm sure she'll tell us a bit more about what she does. Thank you very much for accepting to host this event. Joe is not yet a CARISTEM member, but we hope to make her one eventually. So thank you very much for accepting to host the event, and we hand over to you, Joe. Thank you.
Thank you, Fred, for that very interesting introduction. So my name is Jo Gay, and I work as an environment team leader at a Central London local authority. My connection to CARISTEM is through Fred, so thank you to Fred and Nick and the rest of the steering group for allowing me to take over this last session of 2020. So as Fred mentioned, I have an environment specialism, but I'm also a town planner. And I thought it would be interesting to do a bit of reflection about what 2020 has meant for us in terms of the pandemic, and going forward, what we think or what we hope will happen in the environmental space. So we know that environmentally, COVID has been an interesting time. We've seen improvements in many areas. So in London specifically, we talk about the improvements to air pollution with the reduction in car use and people traveling. It's had a really positive effect on that. In the Caribbean, we can see that there have been improvements in the oceans, and even talk about fisheries levels which had previously been depleted being restored to a certain extent. So whilst COVID has decimated lots of economies and has had a detrimental public health impact for lots of people globally, there have been some real significant environmental improvements. And so the question that I'm interested in discussing, understanding, challenging, debating today is really about whether COVID-19 and the global pandemic is going to catalyze a new environmental resurgence, whether when we're talking about the new normal post-COVID-19, whatever that means and whatever that looks like, whether the policies and strategies of organizations and governments are really going to be economically driven, or whether climate resilience, carbon reduction, wider environmental sustainability is going to be front and center at some of these decision-making processes. So I have a very UK and London-centric perspective, but I have an understanding of what's going on in the Caribbean. So I know, for example, that global greenhouse gas emissions, only 2% really are emitted from the Caribbean. But I also understand that, for example, tourism and the impact of tourism on the Caribbean is 97% of each island's, up to 97% of a Caribbean island's emissions. So there are some real checks and balances that we need to consider in this wider environmental debate. And I think that when we talk about environmental sustainability in its broadest sense, we cannot but touch on economic and social resilience as well. And so I'm looking forward to an interesting discussion on quite a broad topic. So I think I'll hand over to the people that I'm seeing on screen. If anyone's got any thoughts or ideas or wants to start us off, I'm happy to engage.
Okay.
Fred.
So as a self-confessed transport geek, one of the things that worries me quite a lot or concerns me quite a lot is the emissions from transport. I know lots of countries like the United Kingdom and more advanced economies, and of course they have the ability to do so because they often funding is not such an issue for them as it is for Caribbean countries. But I wondered what can be done within the area of transport alone. For example, I mean, we depend, that cuts across many sectors, by the way. We depend heavily on tourism, and aviation, for example, is one of the biggest sort of contributors to greenhouse gases. So I
Yeah.
just wondered what can be done. So around the tourism sector, but also thinking about sort of, individuals and how they travel and whether or not there is scope to, to innovate and to sort of, address the emissions, transport emissions from the, say, for example, from tourism.
Yeah, that's a really interesting perspective. I think there are some quite clear distinctions between kind of a UK or a European perspective and in the Caribbean. So in the UK, and specifically in London, when we think about public transport, for example, so individually how we move around, you know, we have real access to really good quality public transport, and so there's a kind of an individual perspective about whether, it's more important to look at your personal safety, especially in a COVID context, or actually whether the opportunities to use public transport and to be safe on those modes are appropriate for you, and those are risks that are taken on an individual basis. I think when we're talking about the Caribbean, transport has a really different impact, because I think that with the level of public transport that there is and the size of the islands, the way that people move around is different. And I also think that there is a kind of top slice of ensuring that countries that are developing have opportunities to experience the benefits of technology, including transport as well. And so they're not resigned to not having the opportunities that developed countries have had. And so I think it's really interesting to think about individual responsibility and how people are moving around the island, how people are working from home or not, and the infrastructure that supports them in that. I think when we talk about tourism, though, especially in the Caribbean, I think it's really interesting because for me, it feels like there are kind of quite a few layers of tourism within a Caribbean context. So you've got tourism within the Caribbean as a whole. Um, you've got tourism from people who are within the diaspora, but not within the Caribbean. So for myself and my family, we go back to the Caribbean regularly. It's not a holiday. We're not going to Sandals and going on an all inclusive, but our carbon footprint for those journeys is significant. And it's important to think about when we're starting to say globally to reduce air travel, the impacts that it has on people that are far away from their home, however they define their home. But I think for a lot of people who don't have that connection to the Caribbean, when they think about going to St. Lucia or Barbados or Trinidad for a holiday, it is that kind of stereotypical all inclusive, an 8 hour flight to get to the sun, to have a 2 week beach holiday or to do golfing. And I think the impact not only of the flight, but also of the hotel, which is a kind of a 24-hour carbon emitting machine between the laundry and the waste, and the fact that a lot of the food is imported. So people who go to chain hotels in the Caribbean are not going to be eating green banana and ackee. They're going to be expecting and wanting fish and chips or baked beans or dim sum or whatever it is. And I think when we look at that kind of tourism perspective from a whole and not just the flight, I think that the carbon impacts are actually quite significant. And it's quite interesting to take a step back and think about, is there a way that the Caribbean can benefit from touring but actually minimize the impact from a carbon perspective? um, and kind of how would they balance that? How would you make your tourism offer interesting and attractive to bring people in, and the money that they bring with them, but really think about prioritizing that carbon reduction perspective? I don't have the answers on that, and I think for government, their concern is really going to be economic progression. And I think it's going to be a hard ask for a government to say, you know what, tourism is important, but our environment is more important. I'm not sure that there are any governments really that are at that stage.
So you mentioned so friend asked about tourism,
Mhm.
and you mentioned the different um, kind of levels of maybe transportation impact on the environment.
Yeah.
So you said the flights, the hotels, and transporting goods to the hotel. So just some of them.
Yeah.
So for me, I think some of those things, you can imagine how they, from a design point of view, they actually make it easier to control.
Yeah.
So controlling emissions within the hotel, I think is easier than saying you have it spread all around the island. So I think that's easy design. So you can imagine, you say that you make hotels more environmentally efficient. Um, you also mentioned transporting goods and foods
Yeah.
to the hotels. I think that's actually something like you can imagine countries having policies and hotels having policies where they say they use supplies from local supplies. Now, let me give you an example of a country where I know they definitely have environmental policy
Mhm.
in their country with regard to how they promote certain things. And that's Dominica.
Okay.
So Dominica definitely has tourists, they advertise themselves as a country which makes use of the environmentally conscious.
Yeah.
So I definitely know, for example, I was speaking to someone earlier this year about a project where they wanted to redesign a set of distilleries for
Right.
spices.
Yeah.
But the whole idea was not only they get a good markup on the oils, but they were looking at using the making the distilleries more environmentally run. So
Yeah.
not using electricity of the grid, so
Yeah.
that they could also run from using maybe wind power, water, rivers, the sun, and they could also advertise them as being environmentally conscious producing things. So they're using that as their marketing ploy.
Yeah.
And I do know for a fact, like in Trinidad where I lived for a few years, they never built hotels on their beaches.
Yeah.
They have strict policies against that.
Yeah.
Right? Hotels are always away from beaches. And so while I come from St. Lucia, I am aware of some of the other islands that they are they have a little more stringent rules about how they build things, etc. And they also use um, the environmental feature as a
Yeah.
selling point
Yeah. Yeah.
for them, I would
Yeah.
say.
I think there is definitely a market for environmental tourism, but
Mm,
I think that it is not the majority of the market. And so
okay.
it may be that there are islands, if we think about the Caribbean as a whole, it's many islands, and it may be that a proportion of them say, you know what, I'm going to go down, fully embrace the ecotourism route.
Yeah.
And I think that they would be able to generate income. But I think for other islands, they may not see the kind of the wider benefit of it, because I think that if you're going down the environmental tourism route, I think that you either need to go like whole hog, like, you're super, I was going to say low tech, and I don't necessarily mean that, but I think that you really take it seriously and you will attract a certain kind of customer. But I think that, as with all things, there can be a certain level of greenwashing. And so people will say things like, we use recycled water, but then they're
Mm,
still putting bottles of Evian into your room, and you
mm,
still have a fan that's going, all day. So I think it's really about checks and balances. I think when we're thinking about policies for hotels, um, I think it's interesting to understand what the driver is for that policy. So is
mm,
it a safety driver? Is it actually an environment driver? Is it a planning, building regulations driver? I think those things are really important, because something can start off as a planning driver, and then you can add those environmental elements on top.
mm,
But I think if you're not, but if genuinely what's happening is that you're not integrating environmental carbon reduction decision making from the moment that you decide
mm,
that you're building your hotel, or
mm,
from the moment that you decide that you're doing 24-hour a day catering, I think that things can get lost in the mix.
mm.
And it becomes easy to say, well, we're doing this, so we don't have to do that. So it becomes a case of, I'll give you 15% there, and I'll give you 80% there, and we'll make up the difference. So
So yeah.
go
So
ahead.
I maybe have a slight bias,
Hmm.
and like my major concern of the environment is not really the hotels, but um the general population. and lots of the other things that are. Now, I say that not to stray,
Mm,
but I think countries, just like businesses, culture is an important thing. So I
absolutely.
think it's hard to say you're going to have a tourism industry which is environmentally conscious and everything else in the culture is not,
Exactly.
right? Yeah. And I think that's why countries like Dominica is maybe easier for them to do it because they've maybe always, as far as in my time since I was maybe like 1920, coming to more contact with Dominicans,
Yeah,
they've always maybe been a little more conscious of their environment, their culture, right?
yeah,
In terms of how they think. So I think just like if you're trying to get people to think about the environment, I think to just say you're going to have, I'm only going to make the water company environmentally conscious or the tourism, I think it's not going to, I don't think
no,
it's going to work because I think you need a cultural shift in general.
yeah.
I mean, so
I
I think targeting specifically one industry, it's maybe not going to work.
No, I would absolutely agree, but I do think that tourism is an interesting one to consider because
Okay.
impacts are so significant. But I would completely agree that an environmentally conscious country
Mm.
makes it easier, makes things much more straightforward. So if we think about recycling and waste management,
Yeah.
in some parts of the UK, it's really straightforward. In other parts, it's really difficult for a variety of
Okay.
reasons. I think when we look to Scandinavia and we see that they are able to have, 7 different waste streams in their homes, it's because their homes are built with the infrastructure to support it, which means that
Mm.
everybody does it, which means the outcome is that their waste stream is significantly less. And so I
Yeah.
think the Caribbean, there are lots of areas where it would be really quite straightforward to implement policies around uh, renewable technologies, for an
Yeah.
example. So really, should anybody be paying for any of their electricity off the grid? If you
Mm.
have a country with, you know, 6 hours of sunshine a day, 11 months of the year, really, culturally, are we in a space where we understand the benefits and we're harnessing that technology? Are we looking at potentially wind farms, not necessarily in the Caribbean Sea, but in parts in the Atlantic? Do you see what I mean? Are we really harnessing wave power in the way that we
So again, that's something I'm aware of. And I do know, for example, that in 2019, the French government in collaboration with Martinique, was the department, they had a research project where they were putting in a deep sea um, power generation system that was going to be based on thermoclines in the
right,
sea, in the Atlantic Ocean.
right,
You have to remember also, what most of the Caribbean islands don't have the technology, right? So if you're going to import, so Martinique can do this because they're doing it in collaboration with the French government.
yeah,
Okay, and so they put it. So these things will come, I think. So there are some things around the Caribbean coming into play. Um,
but is
Also with things.
it coming in island by island, or is it coming, like, does the Caribbean think of itself collectively when it thinks about carbon reduction and climate change?
So I think, especially if the case where I don't think they do. So I think the regional, so if you talk about power generation, you have organizations like CARILEC, so the Caribbean Electricity Group. I don't know if you froze. Um, I spoke, but I didn't see an expression. So did you
No,
freeze?
you had frozen.
Okay, right. So I was saying that for things like electricity, there is CARILEC.
Yeah,
I do not know if they have a policy of moving towards that. But I do know, for example, in St. Lucia, there has been a drive towards um, using using so um, I would only say that I maybe have a specific bet. My view is that it's maybe not it's maybe not the prevailing view. It's my personal view.
yeah,
For years, the power companies have kind of, they've had the monopoly and they've not done anything.
yeah,
And I remember years ago, I wanted to put in some water generation stuff, the farm, and then there's all this thing about how you connect to the grid. So there were lots of barriers in place
yeah,
to even introduce things like solar. But that's becoming less of an issue now
yeah,
because eventually the power companies have started to let people build freer.
Yeah.
But yeah, so there were some barriers. I do not know what the companies like, the regional groups like Carelec doing about, and I don't know if there's a regional environmental group. When I was a teenager after A-level, I used to work for the Caribbean Environmental Health Institute.
Okay.
So I was very interested in the environment. And my job was going to other islands, sampling water samples. I was a chemical technician. That organization, I remember I worked for a scientific company here, providing mass spectrometers. And when I was like a senior scientist, I asked them if they wanted mass spectrometers, and they told me they no longer did research.
Wow.
Right? They were not into that anymore. Yeah. So I don't know what organization deals with environmental health in the Caribbean. The point is that somebody like Sehi previously would have been trying to influence governments, and they were a regional grouping of the Caribbean. So it's a CARICOM, it was a CARICOM entity that was used to drive environmental policy.
Yeah.
I'm no longer in the Caribbean, and I do not know what's the grouping that does that. And maybe Sehi does that now, but I don't think they do, because when I have spoken to them, the staffing is less. They not in as many countries.
Yeah.
So I don't know.
So one of the problems you would say is that there needs to be sort of a body like Sehi to keep driving, environmental policies and environmental, technology.
Agenda. Yes, correct. Yeah.
So I'm keen to hear from Mickey as well, who's been quiet on. I'm sure he had some views on the environmental issues in the Caribbean.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you, Fred. Hello, Joe. Nice to meet you. So one of the things I've been thinking of, indeed, when we look at an environment, the Caribbean and so on, when I think of my economics background and so on, I recognize that, can you hear me clearly?
Yeah, definitely.
Right. That a lot of activity, economic activity, is driven by people moving, going somewhere, going to meet somewhere. So there's a lot, this is key to the design of our economic system, whether in Europe, in US, in the Caribbean, and so on. By definition of that, you create an environmental impact. Now, whether we're talking about tourism, maybe I'm going to the shop, we have a logistics supply chain supplying, as you mentioned, food, what have you. So it comes down to this. With the COVID-19, and as you quite rightly said, Joe, we saw that there's been a positive impact on the environment because that economic activity has gone down. So people are not going out anymore, the tourists are not coming, the water is getting cleaner, the fishes' stocks are going up and so on and so forth. Okay. But that's not sustainable if the economy needs to grow. Because what will the governments do? As soon as the next opportunity, they will open the tap and all the tourists will come in, we will start having the supply chains running and so on and so forth. And so it begs the question, are there the opportunities now? Is this the opportunity now to start saying, what are alternative ways, or maybe a new economic model, a different economic model that would incorporate I don't know, the economic sustainability, but balancing the environment as well. Yeah. Now, there's a lot of things, and when I go to the Caribbean as well, I see, I can confirm, the hotels apart, let's look at culturally and people. Do we have the, for the garbage, separation of paper, plastics, and biodegradables and so on? I don't see a lot of that happening. Yeah. A lot of white goods that we import, so the white goods are the washing machines, dishwashers, and so on and so forth. When it reaches the ends of life, what happens to that, right? We now start having a whole lot of electronic devices that have batteries. Yeah. What happens to these afterwards? Basically gets put in a dump somewhere or what have you, right? So there's an environmental impact on all of these things where, and quite rightly, what I've been hearing is saying, we need to have the policies that will drive a cultural change, that will drive people to think differently. And potentially to start acting differently as well and designing whatever they have to do differently. And it's something where we don't have, I don't have the answer, but we can look at things and say, okay, could we start solar panels, for example? Okay, 12 months out of the year, we have approximately, 12 hours of sun, maybe 11 hours of sunlight, let's say, okay? Electricity generation via solar could be a big, could have a big impact, moving away from gas or coal or whatever the power plant is using. But then there's the economic investment, the capital investment needed to do that, which is quite big, right? And the countries, the governments, it's not like maybe in Europe, in the US and so on, where they're going to start subsidizing your investment, So then unless we see these sort of initiatives coming from governments, people or policymakers and so on, people will not change. Someone out of the goodness of their heart might say, okay, let me separate the paper from the plastics and so on. Let me go ahead and see how can I recycle or do other things. But for it to have an impact, it needs to happen on a global scale, regional scale. So these are the thoughts that I've been having, and I just wanted to share that with you because I think we're going down the right direction in what we're discussing in terms of, I think we all aligned in that view. And it's really how can we as STEM make a difference?
So I think, right. So maybe part of the problem we have here is that we don't have many people in the Caribbean. But there are some things that I do know on this call, right? So for example, in the island of St. Lucia, so that's why I pointed out some examples of places where people are doing things. There is a drive for solar energy. It has come a little late to the party, I think. That's why I said I have a particular bias, right? But for example, the Lucilec does have solar farms, right? And they're in the south, for example. There is a recycling program in the island. I don't know how it works, how effective it is, if they have this situation. But as you said, Michael, all of these things cost money. So for example, while the power company can have a solar farm, it's maybe a little bit much to ask residents to put solar panels, which they currently do, some of them.
Yes.
If, for example, in the UK, I think in the 90s, and there was this drive where the government would subsidize if you put, you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah.
But obviously our governments don't necessarily have that. So there is a problem with the finance, and we don't have the technology.
Yeah.
We don't have the ability to repair, we don't have all those things. So a lot of the things we have, while we do have solar powered systems. So for example, if I was creating an engineering, if I had a project in St. Lucia and I was maybe creating a factory, I could decide my factory could be solar powered. I could have a unit that was testing things and I could have it. That's okay. But to say that you were in a village of Babuno and you were going to kind of make Babuno, the area of Babuno, use solar power in general, I don't think we have the finance to do that. And I could be wrong. Maybe somebody's going to tell me, yeah, we could roll out solar everywhere. But I don't think we do at this point.
Yeah, you're right, Nick. It's quite a big, so on the individuals themselves to go ahead and make that investment is a big capital investment for them. And you're quite right as well. In St. Lucia, I did see some of the farms. I was there in February earlier this year, and I did see some things happening. But at this, let's put it this way, at the scale of, let's say, energy that could potentially be produced, and what we are producing, there's a huge gap, and so that's one. If I look at the scale, yes, there is some recycling and so on, and that's happening, but at the scale of the recycling that's happening and the scale of the amount of waste being generated, there's also a big gap.
But
I would say, opportunities.
I'll say two things about that.
Yeah.
Which is what you pointed out, one of these. Right. first of all, to recycle at scale, you need investment to recycle.
Yeah.
And then the second thing is something I mentioned earlier. In every place I've seen where you bring on recycling, you have to have a campaign.
Yeah.
Because you have to change culture. You cannot just, people are not just going to recycle because you tell them, let's recycle. You're going to have to have a sustained campaign to get people recycling. And maybe it's a thing that can be done, and as part of this awakening process, do it. But as I said, so I think the topic is stimulating environmental awakening. And
Yes.
I agree with that. It's maybe an opportunity. People can see some of the benefits. So if you move away, so I think when people think about tourism, we're thinking of a small section of tourism when you think about the hotels.
Yeah.
I think that's a small section of tourism. I think if you think about the effect of the environment on the health of our people,
Yeah.
right? Because if you let's think about why would people be more interested in improving the environment? Because if you're going to have some policy and you want people to change, you have to show them why it will be beneficial to them, right? So let's say you think about the fact that if we take care of our mangroves by not putting pesticides in the water, then we will have more fish nurseries for fish, and we will be able to sell our island as having better coral reefs. So you understand? That's the way I think about the environment. I don't think about it as just the tourist only. I don't think about it. I think you have to tackle a number of things at one go. And I think this is maybe an opportunity. Now you can show to people, do you have an example in this period in time when you see fish stocks being improved? So then, yeah, that's what can happen, right? If you improve fish stocks, right? And therefore you encourage people in villages, you give them a reason why it's beneficial to them. It might be beneficial to other people, such as taking care of your mangroves will improve the lives of fishermen, will improve the lives of villagers, people living in villages. In the case of St. Lucia, people living in places maybe like Dennery, Fred, for example. You understand what I'm saying? People living in places like Miku, people living where their fishing is their livelihood. You can show them how that will improve that. But for me, the environment and pollution affects your people, which affects our health also, right?
Yeah.
And this is our main resource, our human beings.
Yeah.
But I think what you're saying is the same kind of globally. We need the evidence to support a policy. We need the money to develop the infrastructure, and we need the behavior campaign to create culture. And I think that as much as infrastructure development is financially costly, the behavior change is always the part that takes the longest and is the hardest hurdle to get over. And I think that we see that replicated in Europe, in the US, and everywhere. And I think one of the things that Mickey said that I thought was really interesting was about we need to develop an economic model that is different from what we've had previously, because you do what you did, you get what you got. And we know that economic model that there was pre-COVID worked for many people, but it didn't work for more people, and it absolutely didn't work for the environment. So I think there's an opportunity. When I think about the environment, I think about it as applied science. So I think about it as applied biology, applied chemistry, applied physics. And if there is a culture of STEM within the Caribbean, if we're thinking about what CariSTEM can support, there is real opportunity for the evidence and the understanding to lead the policymakers to a strategy that will develop into a behavioral change campaign and develop that circle. And I say that the other thing that we're seeing a lot in Europe is that, environmental crisis is global. So there are lots of universities and funding campaigns that are saying, if there is somebody out there that can develop a solar panel that is 2 millimeters thick, we will chuck money at them. And I think there is real opportunity for people in the Caribbean to really take advantage of the advancements in technology to bring them over, to liaise and work and collaborate with the West and with Africa and with Asia to really develop a product that works for them, that they can produce at cost for them. Because I think the other thing is that there's no point somebody in Dorset producing a solar panel that you then have to transport air freight to the Caribbean. It's really about developing what is the right solutions for your region. And I think there are opportunities there that can definitely be picked up.
So I agree with you in a lot of what you said. Fred, go.
So I was going to pick up on a point that you made, Joe, about developing a different economic model, and also that's something that Mickey picked up on as well. I think with for planners, we're sort of we're always in the space of thinking about having the economic, environmental, and social issues in balance, and that's the sort of, in our minds, that's the right sort of balance, that's the right way to go about to pursue policy. And one of the things I was going to say is, I think too often we don't think about the externalities of so Nick's point about like solar power being too it's expensive, and the funding that you need for individuals, and whether or not government should step in. But I think government also should look at the bigger picture and look at the externalities of some of the things that we are seeing in the Caribbean. In fact, actually, look at the implications for a large section of the population. In terms of, like, let's use the example of traffic congestion, for example. Lots of people, if you put it in the context of the United Kingdom, for example, lots of people die from, prematurely from lung diseases. Now, that's something that you've got to think in terms of when you're thinking of funding for transport improvements. That's an issue that needs to be taken into account. I don't know that we're thinking in terms of the impacts, or the environmental impacts, the negative environmental impacts, and monetizing these, and then justifying the sort of policies or the funding that that the government might actually make available to actually improve, in certain sectors, in the energy sector, for example, or tourism. So I think as part of your changing or updating the economic approaches, I think there needs to be some thinking about other impacts that are not currently monetized, but are just as important for communities.
Yeah, I think there's a really significant public health co-benefit that aligns very clearly with the environment, and I think that it's definitely a way to kind of share the message with communities. If somebody's not going to respond to fish stock eating, and so change your behavior, they'll definitely respond to this water is poisoned. Do you see what I mean? So I think there are lots of ways to share the message, and I think it's about finding the right button to push for that community. So in London, we're all about air quality because it's really prevalent, and asthma's on the rise in young people, etc., and all of those things. And I think it's about really, I think for me, it comes back to the evidence about really understanding what it is that people in the Caribbean respond to. What is the evidence telling us about their life expectancy? What is the evidence telling us about their actual environment? And where are the opportunities to make big pushes? Because I think, the environment covers a huge, it's a real depth and breadth of activity. And it's really about, where are you as a policymaker or as an organization, where are you going to make the biggest strides to have the biggest outcomes?
Yeah.
So, all right. So I'll tackle one of the things you said. As an organization, I think there are things CARISTEM can do. My personal approach to many things is a multi-pronged approach. Yep. So people like to have this idea of okay, we're going to go, we think this is the best idea. That's not my kind of general strategy, right? But that's just me, right? So So my view is that CARISTEM as an organization can do things in terms of providing help, in terms of informing people about we could provide information on what are the bodies that provide funding.
Yeah.
Right. We could make that known. We can have workshops. We can have talks where we say these organizations. We can have somebody from a given organization come and talk about the types of funding. We can have some. So then we can provide expertise in how to get funding. Because one of the things I learned at King's was that some people can do research and some people just don't know how to get money.
Yeah.
Right. And that's the same when you start to work.
Yeah, bid writing is a very specific skill set.
Yeah, it's a specific skill. So maybe we could develop those skills within the group, right? Maybe we have people within the group who can do that, applying for grants. And so maybe that's something we can do. Because maybe the other things that people don't know. I remember when I was a teenager, I remember I used every kind of means I could find to find scholarships around the world. But many people don't do this. And even if they have the internet now. So
Yeah.
I find that lots of people have the internet, but they just don't use it, right? They're still stuck in their local mindset.
Yeah.
Or most people. And I'm not being particular to the Caribbean. This is even true in the United Kingdom. You will still only hear people talking about, I live in Reading. They will only be talking about what goes on in Reading. Or they live in London, and they just don't look past their local environment. So maybe we can provide resources for people in terms of access to things, resources in terms of helping people write up proposals, resources in terms of, giving tips on those areas. So I think we could help in that area. With regard to some other things, I would say the ministries in the country that I have the most experience with working with the ministries is St. Lucia. The ministries they are aware of some of the funding, but as with most things, it's just like in a company. If you have people that don't have initiative or they always feel they're overloaded, I don't mean to offend people, but again, my thing is maybe like a get things done kind of person.
Yeah.
That's how I was.
Absolutely.
That's how I was in academia. I organized all my funding for everything, right? And I have to accept not everybody has those skills, right? So even when I'm working with the Ministry of Education now, I am aware that, right, maybe they don't have the chat, they don't know how to call somebody. Nicholas, I have no shame. I will call this person, and sometimes that's what it's required.
Yeah.
So they are sometimes aware. And I will say that if you point out to them, if you join that dot for them, they will go for it. Because it's the same way I do business, right? I think you should make it. When I worked, I made it easy for my CEO. I go to a board meeting and I tell you how you're going to influence other people. And I think it's the same thing when you give them the plan so that when they're talking, it might be your words, right? But you make it easy for them to sell to somebody else. So for example, we currently have a project with the Ministry of Education, with students. And one of the students' proposals is actually garbage handling and sorting. Now, that might be very technically difficult, but what I'm pointing out is that people are thinking about that. The ministries are doing this, right? And this week, I have another meeting with the Ministry of Agriculture, and I've put the Ministry of Agriculture together with the Ministry of Education to discuss another project, which is about aquaponics, etc. So people are thinking about them. They're doing, but you have to remember, we are still, especially, we are poor country. At the end of the day, we are poor.
Well,
and
financially poor, yes, but I think in terms of mind, not really. And I think there is a lot that can be done with facilitating conversation and developing a partnership with another organization. And I think if you start thinking about the money first, the project will never work. And actually, it's about the idea and the germ of the idea and what it can develop into.
So I agree. I think the money is not the problem, but but I'm saying what I think most people think. Right? Otherwise, I wouldn't be doing this. My general view is that businesses make money. So I think most people tend to think that you need lots of money to start a business. I don't have that opinion. Maybe that's why I'm not rich. But you just need.
Rich is relative, isn't it?
Rich is relative. But I think if you have an idea and people want it, they will buy it, and then you will make money. So you will make money. Now, there are some kinds of projects which need initial capital and funding. But I was just pointing out to you all that the ministries are aware of some of those things. Sometimes they have problems in terms of finance. Sometimes they have problems in terms of project management. Sometimes it's just like any other thing.
Yeah.
You may just not have the right person to sell the project, or you have to, they've maybe not taken into account all the other things they need to do, like the marketing, the idea to somebody. They've maybe, and we can help them with those things. And I think, and that's what we try to do. You know, so we try to, well, I try to facilitate. I try to bring people together. I try to give them a concept, you know, like which they can sell to the minister. You know, this is how you go. I don't say this. I'll say, well, you know, it will attack education. It will attack youth. It will attack the environment. You know, you give them all the things that they can see to tick a bunch of boxes.
Yeah. So I think this is great, Nick, because and I didn't know that to the extent that you were doing. I think this is great, and this is where a lot of value can be brought, because if we can get the ministries to start looking really deeply and closely at this, and get the governments involved, maybe the missing link is about doing this change management to get people's value system to change. Probably that's the missing link. And then once we get the ball rolling, it can go, because, you know, a lot of these things, and I would say this, you talked about creating a company and so on and so forth, but a lot of the reasons why governments do things is driven by economic benefits that they will get. Okay. Either they can get more taxes, or they provide jobs for people and so on, so they get re-elected. That's fundamentally how a lot of the politicians work. So the vision about we attacking this, maybe we're making the opportunities come out because of solar, because of recycling, because of this, that, maybe new companies pop up as a result, is a good thing, and that can really help the economies. These are the potentially for countries like St. Lucia and so on, where we can see that grow quite rapidly, and at the same time having a positive impact on the economy, on the environment, and having a positive impact on the economy as well. So yeah, this is.
So I think one of the things, I'll just say one thing. One of the things you said, I think, is true.
Yeah.
Is that maybe that it's not just about technical skills. So even people supporting them with how you round up policy. Yeah. But again, the people skills need to be right, because sometimes people have managerial. They understand they've done managerial theory, but they don't know how to talk to people. My man, to be quite frank, you know.
Yeah.
You know, so you cannot. Obviously, you are. So, but the governments and people in the ministries can assistance in terms of managing projects, in terms of getting things done, would be useful for them. I think it would be very useful. It's not just technical knowledge that's needed.
I think the other opportunity is that an environmental project doesn't have to be called an environmental project.
I missed what you said, Joe.
Sorry, I'm saying that sometimes an environmental project doesn't have to be called an environmental project. It can be a hardcore project. It could be a straight physics or a straight chemistry project, but actually it's an environment project too, because of that applied science element. And I think there is something important about working out, you know, if there is an island that has a real propensity for biology and biodiversity, that's how you present the project, even though ultimately the objective meet your environmental outcomes, but you can present the project in whichever way works for the audience that needs to hear it. And I think that there's something in this kind of behavioral, cultural community around.
So I will add one thing to that I think I've learned both in the UK and in the Caribbean. It's not just the policymakers you have to think about when you setting up projects. You have to think about the people doing the projects. So for example, with the schools, I think children are very in tune with the idea of environmental projects. All of the children are excited about doing something, I think, because that's what's in the news. That's what they're reading about. So it is not something I would say that if you presented an idea as an environmental project, children will jump at it.
Yes, but people who were in their 80s may not necessarily.
But people in this might not. So then saying they were aged, and because at the end of the day, it's not the people in the 80s that are going to do it.
Well, fair enough.
You have to remember that too.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right? So you have to think about the audience who's actually going to have to do it. And in the case of companies like the Ministry of Education, they are very acutely aware that they want to engage young people. So if you give them a project that engages young people, if you stray away from environment and you said you give them something to do from a mobile phone, they have an idea that will appeal to young people.
Yeah.
And if you give them something to do with environment, so this is not something that is hard to sell. That's what I'm pointing out to you. It's not hard to sell, right? What you might have to sell to is the other parts. You have to come ready with things like as a group.
Yeah.
How are you going to help them finance this? It's the other things you need to do. It's like talking to one of my friends sometime last year about talking to people about business and ideas. You cannot just say, I want to do an environmental thing. You have to come with other things around it. You need to come with, if you want to do an environmental thing, how are we going to finance it? You have to be willing. The people we as a group or anybody speaking about those things, they need to be ready to discuss those other ideas.
Mhm.
That's what I think.
Yeah. Agreed.
Yeah.
But
Can I just say something about so I pick up on a point that Mickey made about I think I'm thinking back as a child in solution, thinking about whether or not I ever thought about the environment and the economy as being integrated, as opposed to sort of looking at them as sort of two separate things. And I think sometimes it could be very, very much maybe more at the government level and in terms of like how economic policy and that going back to the need to sort of have a new economic sort of model. Is that there seem to be sometimes a separation of what's important for the economy and what's important for the environment. And I think that the two things are so interrelated that they can't be separated, especially when you think of the context like St. Lucia and other Caribbean countries that depends on tourism and must also sort of cherish their environment because their biodiversity, because that's what their tourism product depends on. So sometimes thinking of tourism product but separate of from the environment, I think is a terrible way to be looking at things and a terrible way to be planning. And the point that you also made, Nick, about when I mentioned about sort of looking at perhaps maybe like the energy sector, the tourism sector, and what can be done. I think a point you made was about maybe thinking in terms of how like maybe hotels are designed, for example. It's not hard to say if you're making an investment in a multi-million-pound hotel that you could actually be generating power from renewable energy sources, and that could be a policy that's stipulated easily by by the planning department or the government itself to say, okay, you're going to be dependent a certain percentage of your the energy requirements of your hotel is going to be dependent on renewable energy. It's not hard to instigate these policies to ensure that we have a sustainable tourism product. So you're going to build a big hotel. Maybe you could look at how you the materials that you use, so you achieve sort of better sustainability, as you mentioned, Nick, in the design of the buildings that you're bringing forward. So there are things that we can do. We've been doing things, I think, the wrong way. And I think that's because the environmental sustainability thread it does not run through all of the decisions that are made by government for the tourism sector. So it might be, again, I think the point is about having another look at the economic policies that we have currently and maybe making changes to that so that it favors environmental issues a bit more.
So what I'd add to what you said is two things. Negotiating one-on-one, you don't give somebody only one way out. You have to give them another way out, Fred.
No, I wasn't suggesting
so
that.
If I was so I wouldn't, if I was presenting an idea, I wouldn't say it's easy to have to tell the hotels that you must present that. I might say one possible scenario is the hotels could either have a policy where the hotels must provide so much percentage renewable energy, or if they provide renewable interest in amount, you give them a rebate on tax for something based on that. So I would always give them one or two. So at least you may be willing to be happy with one, so you give them a few. The other thing I would say is that you mentioned environmental policy and economics. Now, while that might be true and it might be important, I think the argument you make is dependent on the person you're speaking to. So if I'm speaking to you, who I know you're a transport planner, I'll maybe make that argument. I'll make the argument that it's the environment affects economy, which helps, yeah? Whereas if I'm speaking to a 16-year-old and I might think that they don't get the economics thing, I might talk to them about the future.
Yeah.
Right? So I might say, protecting your environment is protecting the future for you. It might be the same, like, they're all valid arguments, but I think the argument you make is dependent on the person. So again, I would say that there is never one, I don't believe there's ever one solution.
No,
we can present multiple,
Yeah.
there are many ways that that environment, considering the environment is good for the countries. And so we could do that. And maybe that's something we could do on CARISTEM, right? We could actually present some of the reasons why it's good.
Yeah. I mean, the point I was, the wider point I was making is that I think we need to maybe get into the mindset that the environmental thread needs to run through everything. I think that's more of the point. And of course, there needs to be both carrot and sticks. So I'm not saying that, you penalize.
No, the reason.
Yeah.
The reason I mentioned what I said about economics, because you started your argument by saying when you were a child, you never made the connection between. So I thought what you were saying is that we should be making this connection to kids. And what I'm suggesting is it's maybe not the best argument for a kid.
So
that's all I'm pointing out.
But I think you could introduce to kids. Yes. But of course, you need to find a way to introduce it. I think you make the link between the for example, I know tourism is an important sort of sector to the St. Lucia economy from a child. You know how important tourism is. But you make the connections between tourism and the effects of tourism, the benefits, and also the disbenefits of tourism, and the need to protect the environment. So I think you could start teaching children about wider economic issues without necessarily sort of throwing an economics textbook at them and formulas at them. So I think you can start teaching them about sort of the practical everyday things around them, so that they understand these concepts. Granted, it's about more ensuring that they have as little an understanding, and that develops over time. So I never made the connection, and that's from my experience. What I'm saying is I never sort of thought about things holistically as, okay, the impact of tourism in terms of aviation, the impact of, so I think children need to start understanding that, look, when you see a plane land, there's an X amount of emissions that's generated from the plane. Not necessarily saying it's a bad thing, because you have to get the tourist numbers in to be able to generate the sort of revenue that you need, because the country is so heavily dependent on it. But start to talk in terms of there are benefits and disbenefits to everything. So I think that's a way of sort of broadening children's understanding of the interrelationships between these different sectors or these different activities.
So I don't disagree with you. All I was pointing out is that the argument you present to a person is dependent on usually on, I would say, dependent on what they can relate to a little. More easily first. That's all I'm saying. I'm not disagreeing that there is a connection. I'm not disagreeing that people should be taught about that. But there are some things that I think with the difference between adults and it's like when I made the comment about Dennery specifically, fishing villages and the swamp. The idea is that you're presenting them with a concept that they can see related to them, a little more easily. So it's an economics argument in terms of fishing, but it's more related to them, something they can see. That's just my point, right? That while it might be good, I'm not saying it's bad to teach about those connections, but you have to bear in mind the individual. And I thought we were talking about not just education, but about trying to change the culture. So I was maybe more talking about the idea of how do you market an idea.
Sorry, go on, Mickey.
No, I was going to say two things I want to say. One is, of course, Fred, we're all about the same age. So when we were younger, for sure, I mean, the environment wasn't on the radar as it is today.
Yeah.
But, and so, of course, we didn't make the links as we are today. But the other thing I want to say is, for sure, is the following. How we frame, I agree with Nick, framing the arguments based on the context or the audience and so on, that's needed. And that will help gain the traction. But that will also help in driving a cultural shift, a mindset shift in the people who will be affected by this. Mm-hmm. And if we come back to the real, let's say, topic, which is the impact of COVID-19 and having the awakening about this, I think this is the perfect time that as STEM we can go out there and bring those messages, so that people, maybe we start just dropping the seeds so that they start thinking about it.
Yeah.
And as these initiatives keep going, then people might start, putting the dots together, connecting the dots, and start saying, okay, maybe I can do things differently. Maybe I will support, or maybe the government minister will buy into this project because they will see, okay, there's potential for economic activity in my constituency and things like this,
Yeah.
Because at the end, if we have the cultural change, and we don't have the policies, the government and so on behind it, it's not going to happen, and vice versa. So, I think really we need to bundle this and bring the message.
Yeah.
So, Joe, what do you think are the key things that would be needed to create this awakening?
So, I think from a kind of community perspective, so in the UK, definitely a lot of the reflection about COVID-19 has been how communities have come together. So in London, previously, you may not have known your neighbour, you may not have been part of a local community group. And I think one of the impacts of the pandemic has been that, not for everybody, but a lot of people have really garnered that kind of community spirit and had a bit more of an external focus. And lots of local authorities and lots of organizations are thinking about how they can utilize that moving forward, not only for financial efficiencies, but also just as a better way of engaging and working. And I'm thinking about communities in the Caribbean and how that kind of opportunity could be mobilized further. I'm a great believer in taking one action at a time. And I think there are some real opportunities to say to people, if you do just one thing differently, the cumulative impact of that will be significant. So, in environmental terms, we talk about recycling, we talk about air pollution, we talk about all of these different things. But, if somebody just does one thing, so if somebody commits to separating out their waste for a year, the impact of that can be quite significant, and then taking on a next action that is environmental becomes less, because they know that, oh yeah, actually I do, now that I've committed to doing it and I've been doing it for 6 months or a year, that's no problem. So you're then able to incorporate, I don't know, Meatless Monday, or there's a variety of things. So I think that there's an opportunity to plant a seed, literally and figuratively, with community, and really get them to think about things differently. And I think about, my dad's in his 80s. He's from Carriacou, which is a teeny tiny island in the Grenadines. And when he talks about his life, and I appreciate that it's all quite nostalgic, the way that he lived was, for want of a better phrase, closer to the land. So there was less of a consumerist perspective. There was much more of a reduce, reuse, recycle, but it wasn't presented in that way. That was just the way that people lived. So if we had a campaign that said, you don't need to change your mobile phone every 2 years, you can change it every 3 years. Do you see what I mean? There's something about redressing how we look at objects and things, and understanding that buying a new mobile phone is amazing, but actually the impact of that in terms of the heavy metals and all of these other things, and kind of taking that perspective of, if something is not broken, when you think about how you get rid of it, I think there are some messages around that we could really start to look at. I think in terms of governments, and organizations. I think there is a real need for a kind of climate first or a climate resilient perspective to really be integrated in policies and strategies. And something that we've been thinking about where I work is, you know, when you write a policy or a strategy, you have to think about the environmental impact assessment, you need to think about the legal implications, you need to think about the financial implications. And actually, we need to start saying to organizations, if you're writing a policy or strategy, regardless of whether it's around, you know, how much money you need to save over the next 5 years, or how you're going to look after elderly people in care homes, you also need to think about the environmental impact of that strategy, regardless of what it is, because that's the only way that you start to get people who are not embedded in this world to start to think about things seriously. And then for me, I think there's real benefits in economies of scale, and I'd really like to see Caribbean islands working collectively to kind of garner some of those benefits, so that, you know, if St. Lucia is already down the track with purchasing solar PV, that they would be able to support, facilitate, you know, Dominica, Barbados, and Trinidad getting those things too, because I think as much as I appreciate the individuality of those islands, I think if they think about themselves for some things collectively as a region, there are some real opportunities for them to, you know, gain some power. And, you know, that initial financial investment or that initial resource or that initial person, you know, that can be amplified across 10 islands. So I think that at each level there are some, you know, initial steps that we could take to really make some big outcomes happen, you know, and nothing happens overnight, but we could definitely separate out some short, medium, and long-term goals kind of within those tiers of activity.
Okay. I mean, some of the things you said, actually, for example, all projects, that's a good thing, because I guess we do that in our own projects. But we could say that all projects that we do with people, we could set those as some of the criteria.
Yeah.
So as an organization, so when we're working on a project, it must have some environmental impacts. So you understand, that makes sense, I'd say. I'll ask other question. When you said communities, what are you thinking about? Are you thinking about national, like villages, towns? What are you thinking about? How do you define your communities?
It really depends. So, you know, I'm a woman and I might have a community of women around me.
Okay.
I like Batman. I might have a community of other people that like Batman around me. Do you see what I mean? So it really.
So you say target specific kinds of communities.
Yeah. You know, some communities are definitely big, but I think it's a mistake to think that all communities are the same. Yeah. Every community has and can provide something different. Yeah. So somebody who has a 2-month-old baby is a parent, but their things that they are prioritizing are very different from somebody who has a 20-year-old child. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah. That's true. What I'd say is,
who's most affected and who most benefits, isn't it? Yeah.
We have a problem with reach, though. So for example, look at this meeting. We have, Kamla was just coming from Jamaica, but we're all outside of the Caribbean. So when you're talking about things like, so I think as a group, CARISTEM, my idea when we started was that I said, we need 5 years to start getting in there. We are year 3, right? Because I think you can't really change environmental policy until you start having people within the Caribbean as part of CARISTEM in positions who could talk to the right people.
Yeah.
It's all well and good to have your thoughts outside, right? Mm-hmm. The other thing is that I think having actual real physical events, which this year has maybe kind of curtailed. So having events on the ground, because when you have live events with real people, kind of makes a big difference. They get to see you as a real person. So I think even that's important. So these are some things that I think as a group, CARISTEM, and I know this is not a CARISTEM event meeting per se, but as a group, I think it's important to that while you can do certain things virtually, doing certain live things can make a big difference. So I think while we can do some of those things, I think CARISTEM should target some of those things you said as a group, and we should encourage other groups and support other groups who are encouraging with targeting some of those goals. I think that's another thing we should do. It doesn't always have to be about us. I think that we should also bear in mind that the COVID has presented some problems, especially in a culture where many people don't interact online in this way with topics like this. So it actually would be easier to have a live event about the environment, and it's almost like a blog hole, than it is to have to tell people come and talk about the environment. You know, so so we had a slight disadvantage, I think, and we just have to bear that in mind. It's just the time we are in now. So COVID has presented some opportunities, but because of our culture, it's also presented some disadvantages. From the point of view of getting messages across.
But so I would just say something around, so I mean, it's a bit late now to introduce a new issue here, just a new consideration, but like things like supply chains, for example, and it's maybe just making the point around, you know, like it's an opportunity. So lots of people, I guess, would be aware that supply chains have been disrupted. And I suppose people will be aware that maybe they've suffered a shortage, or you know, like you know, stocks are running low on certain items that is imported, for example, maybe from the United States or wherever else. Is that not then an opportunity to say to people, okay, look, we can do it differently. So perhaps we can now start being more reliant on ourselves and producing, you know, some of these items that we need within the, you know, the region itself, within the country itself. You know, instead of relying on, you know, supply chains that could be easily disrupted. So I'm thinking of like the agricultural sector, for example, that could be that we could be more reliant on, foods produced in St. Lucia, and maybe even think more about food processing, on a much larger scale than it's done currently. I mean, I don't know what scale it's at in St. Lucia, but just thinking of these things so that people start to realize, you know what, actually, this is an opportunity for us to, you know, market, you know, ourselves, you know, internally, you know, domestically, and not rely on, you know, produce from the benefit of that is by this supply chains being heavily dependent on air transportation or, you know, I don't know, you know, cargo ships or whatever else, which then have, you know, significant emissions. We could be cutting significant emissions by simply making a change to the way, you know, the foods that we need or the items that we need are produced. You know, I don't know. It's a good idea, I think.
So people have been making that argument.
Yeah.
Right? People have been making that argument. Now, put yourself in another position, right? Not as the supplier, but somebody who has to receive those goods.
Yeah.
So imagine you're now a factory and you're now going to change your whole supply chain to depend on goods from suppliers in St. Lucia.
Yeah.
What do you have to put in place for that to be true?
Well, I think I don't know that St. Lucia has suppliers on a massive scale, you know, as you would suggest. I'm talking about, let's say, the agricultural sector, where you have, you know, people that are potentially like small farmers, for example, who maybe they can't produce themselves, but they can be selling to somebody who comes together. I know we used to have like a co-op in St. Lucia, right?
Yes,
I don't know what happened with the co-op, but perhaps that's again, you know, another opportunity to rekindle that sort of,
So Fred,
the only thing I'd say is that these are ideas people are putting forward.
Yeah.
Right? And there are cooperatives for different kinds of produce.
Yeah.
Cooperative or whatever. But you have to remember, and again, that's just my opinion.
Yeah.
That when people produce a product, they usually have to know that there's a market for it.
Yeah.
Right? So you have to convince the people that are going to supply, first of all, that it's worth them producing that at the quantity, even if it's food.
Yeah.
Then that means also that you have to have a market for it. So you have to have people willing to buy their products also, and not wanting to buy American-made products.
That's
right?
And that's
marketing.
exactly, yeah.
Which some might say in the island of St. Lucia, the marketing board should have been doing for years.
Yeah.
Right? Have any of you ever been to the marketing board?
Yes, I have.
Is that a place you went regularly to shop?
No, I probably weren't once or
Okay.
twice.
Right.
But yeah, I just want to echo the words of Nick, right? Quite right. If the demand is there, it will be sold in the shop. Okay, so you go into Massey or you go into any of these big supermarkets and you get all this because that's what the people want to do. And it comes back to this: change the mindset, get the people's minds to change, and so on. That would be the first. I mean, a perfect example of that is look at the number of cars and some of these like big, fast cars. We don't even have roads for these cars, but they're there in St. Lucia because somebody wants to buy it. That money could be, effectively repurposed, and they say they take half the money they took to buy the car, they could put solar panels on the house, for example. I mean, and that is all about mindset.
Mindset, yeah.
Get the people to change. And quite right. But the other important point you made, Nick, is that even though the demand is there, let's say tomorrow by magic, we change the demand, everybody wants to buy local. Think of the investment needed to change from getting all this important stuff and maybe the processing or what have you to going local. It's not so easy. And it will even have probably a spike in the environmental impact during this process of changing. Yeah. But yeah, in the long run, it will be better. But,
So I agree with you, Fred. I agree with you, Fred. But what I would say is that imagine if COVID is over within the next 12 months.
Yeah.
So imagine if things are back to normal by the end of 2021.
Yeah.
Do you think a local market will be up and running by 2021?
No. I'm not suggesting.
We have to bear that in mind too.
Yeah, I'm not suggesting. Yeah. So I'm not suggesting it has to be up and running, but it's about we're talking about change, and often change could be incremental, but you have to start somewhere. And you're right. If mindsets change, and then there is sort of the change that is sort of instigated, that initiated, then we will see change over time. It might be incremental, and often that's how change is. I think when the nature of what we're talking about here is that it's going to take time for that change to embed. It's going to take time for someone to raise the capital that they need and to set up the business that they need to then start producing. But we know the market is there, for example, and that's you make the point about the market. I'm not thinking of just St. Lucia as a market. We have we have CARICOM, right? That we have CARICOM, which we should be sort of, taking greater advantage of, with, goods being produced in St. Lucia that could, sell in Dominica and the region that, CARICOM covers. So we have a potential market. And, I would argue that if you're producing, for example, orange juice, and that orange juice will sell for 50 cents more or $1 more than what it would sell for, if it came from, Florida, I would argue that actually a consumer would be attracted to that product because the price produced within that domestic market would be, and it has to be of good quality, of course, but the price would be attractive enough to generate sort of consumption. That would be
some guerrilla marketing on this, because we need to get some guerrilla marketing on this, because there is a generation of English people that thinks that avocado toast is a normal thing to eat for breakfast because some famous person said that they like avocado on toast, and now there's a whole thing around avocados. And I think that alongside all of the kind of the sensible interventions, and I do think that procurement is a really important element of this environment conversation, I think that if there was a famous soca person from St. Lucia who said, oh my gosh, the oranges from this farm in Denray or Babonneau are amazing, and I've invested in this farm, then there would be a huge amount of people who would be very interested in shopping local because so-and-so person has done it. And I think we need to also think about, there is more than one way to skin a cat. There is more than one way to cut the pie. And, for some people, that kind of social media, pop culture influence is hugely important. For other people, it will need to come from a kind of a scientific bent, and we need to attack it from all angles to get what we need. But I think we can develop a shop local and local is good and local is better campaign quite easily because St. Lucia has so much to offer. And a bit like with football teams, you know, St. Lucians will say that their mangoes are better than Bajan mangoes and vice versa. So it's not outside the realm of possibility to start to develop those kinds of opportunities and to get people to think that, why am I eating a Florida orange when I could eat, you know, an amazing St. Lucian orange? I think that kind of marketing shift, we just need somebody clever to kind of come and do some kind of guerrilla marketing. But
so I should say something for your information, the group's information. There is a CARICOM initiative currently to have a kind of an agricultural market where goods from different countries are placed on this market and you can sell them and produce a supply to them. So I don't know how far along it is,
but that's in
development,
progress.
but that's currently in progress.
Okay.
I don't have the details on it per se, but I definitely know it's been in since 2019. They've been kind of talking about it.
Bro. Cool. Madam Chair, I'm just checking the time. It's gone 11 now.
2 minutes over. Yeah.
Yeah.
Is there anything else they want to share or?
I am cool. Time for me to go and sleep.
Yeah, it is. That's true. It's I'm an hour ahead of you, so it's getting a bit late for me.
Well, it's been a really interesting conversation. So I just want to say thank you for letting me take over for this session. I've really enjoyed it, and I look forward to seeing all of the activity that CARISTEM is going to do on the environment side.
Thank you very much. All right.
Right.
Been a pleasure.
See you.
Thank you. Yeah, cheers, guys. Hey, Merry Christmas, everyone, because if we don't see each other again.
All right. Yeah, have a good Christmas. Sorry, I should have said.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye.